Last year, when I was 22, I was completely burned out from work and felt disconnected from my own life, like everything was happening to someone else. I had a complicated past, and at that point I was trying hard to distance myself from certain parts of it. More than anything, I just wanted to disappear for a few days and be alone. One day at work, I mentioned this out loud, and a coworker told me about a tiny island off the coast of Maine. He described it as almost painfully quiet. No nightlife, barely any tourists after dark, and most visitors left before sunset. He said staying overnight felt like having the whole island to yourself, which sounded perfect to me. I quickly found a listing for a small standalone cottage right on the shoreline. The price was suspiciously cheap and available on short notice, which probably should have worried me, but I wasn't thinking clearly. I booked it without hesitation. The cottage was very small, one room with a bed, a rarely used kitchenette, and a tiny bathroom. Thick brush surrounded three sides of it, pressing right up against the walls. The front faced the ocean with a single window covered by a thin, semi-translucent curtain that barely blocked the view. The walls were paper thin, and I could hear the wind moving through the brush as if it were right next to me. The door had a deadbolt and a chain lock that both looked recently installed, which felt odd for such an isolated place, but I didn't dwell on it. I took the late afternoon ferry and spent the evening walking around the island. It was surreal watching the place empty out as day visitors returned to the mainland. By nightfall, almost no one was left. There were no streetlights, no background noise, just the ocean. It was beautiful. I ate dinner at a small pub near the ferry landing. The bartender was friendly, but she gave me a strange look when I told her where I was staying. On the way back, I noticed a small dock tucked into a cave about 100 yards from the cottage. A single blue motorboat was moored there. It stood out because all the other boats I'd seen were larger lobster vessels. I noted it mentally but didn't think much of it. I got back around 10:30 p.m., locked the deadbolt and chain, and settled in for the night. Up to that point, I had been really enjoying the solitude. But then I realized my phone wouldn't charge. I tried every outlet in the cottage, but nothing worked. My battery was low, and I knew it would die soon. Luckily, I had a physical ferry ticket, so I didn't really need the phone. Still, I didn't like the idea of it being dead. Exhausted, I went to bed and fell asleep quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I'm not sure what woke me, but once I was awake, I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside the cottage. They were close, right in front of the door, and whoever was out there was walking slowly, pausing between each step. It didn't sound like an animal. I shifted slightly in bed, and the footsteps stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. It lasted long enough that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. I stayed still, staring at the ceiling, too scared to move. A few minutes later, the footsteps returned. This time, there was no mistaking it. They were coming straight toward the cottage. I heard them stop directly in front of the door. My heart was pounding so hard I felt like it was audible. Then a flashlight switched on and someone tried to shine it through the front door. I stayed frozen in fear. The light clicked off and the person tried the door handle. I squeezed my eyes shut and prayed the locks would hold. They did. But that didn't stop them. A few seconds later, they tried again, this time with more force. Then came several loud bangs on the door, one after another. The sound was deafening in that tiny cottage, and I flinched with each hit. That's when my brain finally kicked into survival mode. I knew I had to do something. Without thinking, I jumped out of bed while the banging continued and crouched behind the door, bracing myself. But instead of breaking in, everything suddenly went quiet. I stayed there, barely breathing. Then I heard a man's voice from the other side of the door. "I know you're in there, Leo." Hearing my name nearly made me scream, but I stopped myself. I didn't recognize the voice, but he knew exactly who I was. The footsteps moved away from the door and along the side of the cottage. I followed the sound as it passed the bathroom wall and continued around the building. He was circling it deliberately, like he was toying with me. My confidence vanished. Hearing my own name made me dizzy with fear. For what felt like 20 minutes or maybe an hour, the person kept walking around the cottage. I had no idea what they were doing. Part of me almost wished they would just break the door down so the waiting would end. Eventually, the footsteps faded away. Then, from the direction of the dock, I heard an engine start, the unmistakable sound of a small outboard motor. I listened as it pulled away from shore and disappeared across the water. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The moment it was bright enough, I ran outside. The gravel around the cottage told the whole story. Heavy boot prints circling the building multiple times. They led in a straight line toward the dock and ended at the water's edge. The next day was a blur. I returned the key, caught the ferry, and went home, but I was shaken badly. What still haunts me is this. Whoever was outside didn't come from the island. They came by boat directly to that cottage on that exact night. They knew my name and knew I would be there. I later confronted the co-worker who had told me about the island. He swore he hadn't told anyone about my trip, and I believed him. He looked genuinely disturbed when I explained what happened. I mentioned earlier that I had a colorful past. I won't go into details, but I'm not shocked that someone out there might want to find me. What I can't understand is how they tracked me to a random island off the coast of Maine, knew which rental I booked, and knew exactly when I'd be there. I still don't have any answers. I still live in the same place and work the same job. Nothing has changed since then, and I have no reason to believe it's truly over. This happened many years ago when I was working as a structural engineer and finishing my graduate thesis on concrete degradation in marine environments. It wasn't exactly thrilling research, but it was enough to earn me an invitation to an academic conference in Japan. That detail matters because the trip is what led to everything that followed. I was in Nagasaki for the conference, and through months of email correspondence, I had built a connection with a professor named Dr. Yamamoto, who specialized in post-industrial decay. Thanks to him, I was given a rare opportunity, a research permit to visit Hashima Island. If you're not familiar with Hashima, you've probably seen photos of it without realizing. It's a small island off the coast of Nagasaki that looks like a massive concrete battleship covered in crumbling apartment blocks. It used to be a coal mining facility, and at its peak was one of the most densely populated places on Earth. When the coal ran out in the 1970s, it was abandoned almost overnight. Since then, it has been left to decay. Today, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists can visit, but only along a restricted concrete path on guided tours. Entering the actual buildings is forbidden due to structural hazards. But my research permit allowed me limited access beyond the normal tour route. The morning of the visit, I took an early ferry arranged through the research office. It wasn't a tourist boat, just a small vessel with me and an escort named Tishi. He barely spoke during the ride, which I didn't mind. I was too excited to care. As we approached the island, it played tricks on my eyes. From a distance, it looked small and unimpressive. But as we got closer, its true scale became overwhelming. The massive seawall encircling it, the stacked apartment blocks looming over each other, all of it silent and decaying. I had seen hundreds of photos, but none prepared me for how imposing it felt in person. On the dock, Tishi gave me a briefing. I was allowed into several designated buildings, but there were strict rules. Stay on marked paths, avoid any area sealed with red tape, don't remove or touch unnecessary objects, and most importantly, remain within visual range of him at all times. He repeated that last rule twice. I also had to wear full protective gear, a hard hat, steel-toed boots, and thick reinforced work pants that made walking awkward. Despite all that, the first few hours were incredible. I was taking photos, jotting down notes, completely absorbed in my research. Tishi followed at a distance, occasionally checking his watch as if he couldn't wait for the trip to end. Around midday, we entered one of the larger residential blocks. The stairs were technically intact, but barely. You could see daylight through cracks in the landings. Oddly, Tishi stayed on the ground floor while I went up, even though he had stressed staying within sight. I thought it was strange, but didn't question it. I reached the 4th floor and began examining a section of exposed concrete where the outer layer had separated from the rebar. That's when I noticed something unsettling: the dust patterns. There was dust everywhere, decades of it, but there was also a faint path where the dust looked disturbed, as if someone had walked there repeatedly. Not recently, but often enough that the dust never fully settled back. The path led down the corridor to a room at the end. I should have gone back to tell Tishi. That would have been the smart thing to do. But curiosity got the better of me. I convinced myself he would just brush it off anyway. So I carefully walked down the corridor and pushed the door open. 2 things immediately stood out. First, there was a strange smell in the room. I couldn't describe it properly. It didn't smell like anything natural, but it didn't quite smell human either. It was just wrong. Second, the wall I touched felt warm, noticeably warmer than any other surface on the island. I stood there for nearly half a minute trying to make sense of it. Maybe sunlight had heated the concrete somehow, even though there were no gaps in the ceiling. Maybe animals had nested there, even though I hadn't seen any signs of wildlife on the island. Eventually, I went back downstairs and mentioned it to Tishi. His reaction was immediate and strange. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't seem curious at all. He simply said that what I described was impossible and that no humans or animals lived on the island. When I insisted he come upstairs to see the room for himself, he refused outright. His refusal unsettled me more than the room itself. We continued exploring, but after that I became much more observant. In building after building, I noticed small irregularities, faint markings, subtle signs that something had moved through these spaces before. Nothing obvious like clothing or trash, just enough to suggest that the island wasn't as empty as everyone claimed. When I pointed out more of these details, Tishi didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out his radio and spoke rapidly in Japanese. It was the first time he had used it all day. When I asked what he said, he claimed he was just checking the schedule. I didn't believe him, but I had no way to challenge it. Later, we entered a taller residential block near the center of the island. This time, Tishi hesitated at the entrance, standing still for a few seconds before following me in. Earlier, he had been bored and detached. Now he seemed unusually alert. We climbed several floors together, the stairwell narrow and dim but still structurally sound. On one of the upper levels, I entered a corner room and immediately froze. Against the wall was a pile of blankets and several empty water bottles. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was clear evidence of human presence. I turned to show Tishi, ready to confront him with undeniable proof. But when I stepped back into the hallway, he was gone. Seeing those items hadn't terrified me, until I realized I was completely alone in that building. Suddenly, the situation snapped into focus. Someone was living on that island. Someone had been there recently enough to leave those supplies behind. My body reacted before my mind could. My skin began to itch intensely and panic set in. I rushed back toward the stairwell we had used, planning to get out immediately. But when I turned the corner, my stomach dropped. The stairwell was blocked by a pile of rubble that hadn't been there before. It was enough to prevent me from getting through. I didn't stop to consider whether it had collapsed naturally or had been placed there deliberately. I just turned and ran. I sprinted down the corridor, desperate to find another exit, ignoring structural hazards and debris. As I ran, I heard movement behind me, footsteps stepping into the hallway. I didn't dare look back, I just kept running. At first, I told myself it might be Tishi. But after a few seconds, I realized there were multiple sets of footsteps. I wasn't being followed by one person, I was being followed by several. Panic completely took over. The building felt like a maze, and I was too terrified to think clearly. I felt like I was running in circles. Finally, I spotted another stairwell and practically threw myself down it, barely aware of how I reached the ground floor. All I remember after that is daylight, then open ground, then the dock. Tishi was standing there calmly beside the boat, as if nothing had happened. It started in late November when I decided to take a solo hiking trip in the dense forests of Oregon. I was an experienced hiker, knew the terrain well, and always took precautions. Maps, GPS, emergency supplies, but this trip quickly proved that experience doesn't always protect you. I began early in the morning, the forest quiet except for the crunch of leaves underfoot. The trail I chose was rarely used, and after a few hours I realized I hadn't seen anyone else. That's when it first felt a little off. Too quiet, too still. Around midday I reached a clearing where a small abandoned cabin stood. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, windows boarded up, walls warped. I was curious, so I approached cautiously. The door was partially open, creaking in the wind. Inside, everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, old furniture, broken tools, a rusted stove, all untouched. I didn't stay long. Something about the place made my skin crawl. I turned to leave, but that's when I heard it. A soft whisper. I froze. It was unintelligible, almost like someone speaking in a language I didn't know, coming from the corner of the room. I stepped closer and the whisper stopped. My heart was pounding, but I chalked it up to the wind or my imagination. I continued hiking, trying to shake it off. But as the afternoon wore on, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every few minutes I'd catch glimpses of movement between the trees, quick flashes, too fast to be an animal. The forest that had felt serene in the morning now seemed menacing. By late afternoon I realized I had lost track of the trail. The GPS signal was spotty under the dense canopy and the sun was dropping quickly. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. Panic began to set in. Then I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, and following my path exactly. I stopped, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped too. I moved and they moved again, perfectly mirroring me. I ran, trying to put distance between myself and whatever it was. But it was relentless. No branches snapped, no leaves rustled, just silent, precise footsteps matching mine. Finally, I stumbled upon a small creek which I recognized from my map. I knew if I followed it, I could get back to the main trail. But as I stepped into the creek bed, I looked back and saw a figure at the tree line. Tall, thin, completely still. I couldn't make out features, but I felt its gaze burn into me. Then it was gone. I made it back to the trail by nightfall, exhausted and shaken. I reported the area to the local ranger the next day, but they said there were no records of anyone living or hiding there, and the cabin was abandoned as far as they knew. Even now, I avoid that part of the forest, and sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I swear I can hear footsteps following me, keeping pace just out of sight.